So, Dr. Levin, the goal is to prevent a 2-degree increase in average global temperatures, but this report tells us that even a 1.5-degree increase is going to bring some pretty big changes.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So the Paris Agreement actually has these two goals, as you said, to limit warming well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts for 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. And that was because for some of the most vulnerable countries, you can think about small island developing states, 1.5 degrees Celsius is also going to harm well-being to a tremendous extent. So what this report did was look at what are the differences between warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius of warming, and how much harder is it to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius as opposed to 2 degrees Celsius. And they found that, indeed, we are definitely not on track, and the half a degree of warming actually can make a tremendous difference.
And for example?
So, for example, what they found is they looked across a number of different systems, and they found, for example, for extreme heat, the percentage of the global population exposed to a severe heat wave, which we've already started to experience with 1 degree of warming, at least once every 5 years, is 2.5 times worse with 2 degrees of warming instead of 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. If you think about sea ice-free Arctic in the summer, when you don't have any ice on top of the Arctic, this could happen at least once every 100 years with 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, but at least once every decade under 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And that can impact climate change even further because you have a dark surface that opens up underneath the ice and it absorbs more warmth. Sea level rise is 0.06 meters more with 2 degrees as opposed to 1.5 degrees. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, that translates to millions more people being impacted. Species losses 2 times worse for both plants and vertebrates that lose at least half of their range under 2 degrees of warming as opposed to 1.5 degrees of warming. 3 times worse for insects. Almost 40% worse under 2 degrees versus 1.5 degrees for the amount of permafrost that would thaw in the Arctic. So these are some really big numbers. One of the most devastating and surprising ones to me was for coral reefs, where the report found that under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, we would see 70 to 90% of a further decline in coral reefs. With 2 degrees, more than 99%, wow. Which is just tremendous.
Oh. Does it look like there's any way we're going to be able to stay under that 2.0 degrees?
So what the report finds is that both 2 degrees Celsius of warming and 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming is technically feasible. There have been a lot of modeling studies where analysts come together and see what would have to happen to make that transition happen. Right now, emissions are roughly 52 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. They're projected to increase even with the climate change commitments that we've made under the Paris Agreement by 2030. Instead, we essentially need to halve that amount and go down to 25 to 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year by 2030. And then we actually need to phase out net emissions altogether by mid-century. So this is a tremendous transformation and decarbonization rates that are truly unprecedented at the scale of what we are talking about. It also would require behavioral and technological shifts across the board. So, for example, by 2050, we're talking about renewables projected to supply 70 to 85% of electricity to be able to meet 1.5 pathways. We're talking about reducing energy demand, increasing the efficiency of food production, changing dietary choices, a lot of different measures which we're just starting to do in certain locations, but not at the scale we need.
The president said he wanted to know, quote, who drew the report. I won't go there with that. Can you answer at least who commissioned it? What data they used?
Sure. So the way that the IPCC works is, in this particular case, under the Paris Agreement, there was an accompanying decision, and that decision requested the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to put this report together. And what the scientists do, they commissioned about 100 different scientists and had a very lengthy review process of several different drafts being reviewed, publicly reviewed, and I was one of the reviewers for that. The scientists basically assess all of the recent literature, and in this case on 1.5 degrees Celsius, and see what the science says up to a certain cutoff point where the literature is published. And then they put together a detailed technical analysis. Interestingly, in this case, there's an accompanying summary for policymakers, which was agreed upon in Korea about a week ago. And that all of the governments signed onto, including the United States. And that is actually something that negotiators come, make sure that they feel comfortable with the implications for policymakers. So in this case, part of the answer is that the United States did actually endorse this report.